Hey there. Last time we explored the first hook of the course, UseState. With UseState, we created the functionality to allow the user to conduct a Google search right from the application. With the value and the setter returned from the UseState hook, we're able to track what the user has typed into the main input for the overall search. For the next hook, we're going to explore the UseEffect hook. This hook is called UseEffect since you use it to apply side effects in your React components. So things like setting an interval or fetching data, those are side effects. In other words, they're not directly involved in using the input to the React function component or to create the output of the JSX that it returns. In the days of React coding with traditional JavaScript classes, these kind of side effects would be handled within lifecycle methods like component did mount, component will unmount, etc. Okay, for our first effect, we're going to do a data fetch from an API. And the API that we're going to use is the official joke API. So head to 15dcats/official joke API. Yep, this is an API that I created. And what it does is that it serves random jokes, either one joke at a time or 10 jokes at a time. So head to the README and go ahead and click on the link to get one random joke. What you'll find is going to be something hopefully hilarious like, well, ... That's a deep subject. Pretty good. So in our component, we're going to fetch one of these random jokes within a UseEffect hook and then display it. For starters, create a new file called joke.js within the source directory. And for starters, we're going to import React as well as now the UseEffect hook from the React library. In addition, we're going to need to set up state for this local component. That way we can keep track of the resulting joke from the fetch. So also import the UseState hook. All right, next we'll declare the joke function itself as the component. And then let's be diligent and export this by default right away from the file. Cool. Now for the effect. The UseEffect hook should be applied right at the top of the function, and this takes a callback function. And this callback function fires after every single render of the component. So after the initial render of the component, well, for all intents and purposes, the component has mounted onto the DOM for the application. Therefore, the UseEffect hook can act like a component did mount lifecycle method and fire off functionality once a component has mounted. So this is the exact timing that we want for conducting a data fetch. After all, a fetch is asynchronous. We don't want our render to be blocked by the indeterminate amount of time the asynchronous fetch will take in order to get the data. So conducting the fetch after the mount and then re-rendering to display its data once it's available is the perfect situation. So at the top of the effect, let's call the fetch method. The fetch method takes an argument as the URL for the actual API request. So head back to the actual README of the official joke API and then go ahead and copy that jokes/random endpoint. And then back within the code, once you have it copied, within the string, supply that overall URL. Next, we're going to write up the code that handles the response for the request. Since the fetch returns a JavaScript promise, we follow up with a .then handler. And this .then handler takes a callback which fires with the resulting data once the fetch has completed as an asynchronous function. This callback itself is going to have a response parameter, which represents the result from the request. Now, this response object isn't the JSON itself yet. It's an object with meta information with details about whether or not the request was successful, the IPs that were involved, etc. But this response object does allow us to transform the response from the API into the relevant JSON object using its response.json method. And this returns a promise as well, which allows us to follow up with another .then handler, which will have its own callback to fire once that JSON is done transforming. So as the parameter to this, well, we're going to get the resulting JSON. And for now, let's follow up with a console.log that says joke.json, first as a string parameter to identify, the second parameter of the JSON, which we're actually going to log itself. All right, let's also make sure to return some JSX as a result of this component. So overall, for now, let's return a div. And within this, we're going to have a header 3 element that says joke. Cool. So this joke component is ready to be tested. Once you have all the code, head to the main app.js file, and at the top, import the new joke component from the local./joke file. Then add a horizontal ruler element after the form div. So have a horizontal ruler element, which is HR, then let's apply the joke JSX itself. Then go ahead and visit the app at localhost 3000 in your browser. If all goes well, you should see that React scripts started, or rather restarted the application. You get the joke JSX within your application, and as well, you get the joke JSON within the logs. Very cool. If you refresh, you should get a new random joke as well. Nice. Now that we have this result, let's actually track it within the component in local state. That way we can display the result in JSX. So head back to joke.js, and now we're going to set up a UseState hook. So again, remember that the UseState hook returns an array where first we have the state variable that we want to track. This time, let's call it a joke. And then we have a setter function which we can use to actually set that joke state value. Let's call it setJoke. And then we're going to call the UseState hook, which has an initial value. And a joke is going to end up being an object. So the initial value for the joke is an empty object. And now the idea is that we can set this resulting JSON as the joke using the setJoke method. However, there's a sneaky error if we end up putting setJoke within the UseEffect. And it has to do with the fact that the UseEffect hook runs its callback after every single render. In addition, if you call the setter function on any local state, this will trigger a re-render in order to give the component the chance to display any new data that has changed as a result of calling the setter function. So this can get us in a potentially disastrous situation. First, the UseEffect hook is going to fire once the component actually renders. Once the data is there, it's going to call setJoke. And then calling the setter function causes a re-render of the entire component. And then UseEffect hook is triggered once more, triggering a fetch. Eventually, the setJoke is going to fire. And then once that is done, it's going to re-trigger the component, doing another re-render, going to UseEffect again, going to setJoke, going to re-render, etc., until you're in this infinite loop. So this can end up crashing your application. To demonstrate this, rather than hitting the official joke API, which is public and has rate limiting, I'm going to run the joke API locally, and I would recommend doing so as well. So head back to the course repository at official joke API, so github.com/15dcats/official joke API. Go to clone or download and then copy the repo's address. And then back in your command line, once you have that copied, go ahead and run git clone at the URL. And then once you have it copied, navigate into the repository and run npm I and npm run start. So this will install the necessary modules and then fire the project locally at localhost 3005. So back in your browser, you can manually go to localhost 3005/joke/random to verify that indeed it's running locally, and looks like it is. So let's go ahead and copy that address and make that the temporary address for the fetch within the joke.js file of the application. So I'm going to comment out this fetch, so that way I don't have to recopy the value later. And I'm going to paste in instead that the address is localhost 3000/jokes/random. Cool. Now that it's running locally, it's not a big deal that it could get in this infinite loop. So go ahead and expand out the body of the .then handler, the final one, and then call setJoke, and then pass in the resulting JSON. All right. Once you have that in, go ahead and refresh the application and then keep track of the logs. So back in the application, well, what you should find is this stream of jokes until boom, you end up hitting an error over here and the request is blocked. So as seen, we did indeed end up in this endless loop of UseEffect and state updates, causing the component to overload the API with requests. Eventually, this gets blocked after 100 requests, preventing your IP from making further GET requests to jokes/random. If you visit the API manually in another tab, so go to jokes/random again, you're going to see that the message is your IP has exceeded the 100 request limit, which is set to 15 minutes. Pretty reasonable. Except for us, we only wanted to hit the API once. We should be well below the limit according to the intention of our code. So luckily we have a solution to this that we can use with the UseEffect hook. The UseEffect hook can be customized to only run when certain variables have changed in the component across renders. So these variables are defined using an array as the second argument to the UseEffect hook. So now add an array as a second argument to UseEffect. Now we're not going to provide any variables for the UseEffect hook to run between renders. And the neat thing about this is that by providing an empty array, we're effectively saying that this UseEffect hook doesn't need to rerun again across new renders. Effectively, we've turned this UseEffect hook into a function that only fires after the initial mount of the component in the web applications document. Okay, let's go ahead and check this out. First up, once you have this change, you're going to want to reset the local API so that way the limit is no longer there. So back in the command line, go ahead and kill it with a Control-C and then restart the application with npm run start. Again, it'll refresh and start at localhost 3005. And now in your browser, if you give it a refresh, instead of an endless stream of jokes, you should see one relevant joke within the logs. Cool, so we've now prevented the infinite loop. Nice. With that, we can follow up and complete the rest of the component by actually displaying this joke data. So back in the code, let's take advantage of the fact that each joke contains a setup and a punchline. So before the return statement, we're going to destructure the setup and the punchline variables from the joke object. Cool. And now in our return statement, after the header 3, let's provide a paragraph which displays the setup within a pair of curly braces. And then in another paragraph, we're going to italicize the punchline itself. So we'll also display the punchline within a pair of curly braces, except this one is also italicized with the am tag and then the paragraph tag around that. We can now also safely revert the fetch to the original one at the official API, so that way you don't have to run it locally anymore. Go ahead and save that. And now back in the browser at localhost 3000, what you should find is a new joke displaying for the session right away. Because of the fact each joke happens per session, let's represent that with the header 3 text. So real quick, back in the code, you can say joke of the session. And all right, with that, look at that, the original joke. Well, ... That's a deep subject. Cool. Now we've covered the UseEffect hook. It's a bit like the lifecycle methods from traditional class components, except the UseEffect applies after every render. So it's more of a combination of the old component-did-mount lifecycle method, which ran after a mount, and the component-did-update, which executed whenever the component updated. Next, we're going to create a new component that applies this UseEffect and UseEffect pattern as well, to fetch the latest hacker news in a new component called stories. Feel free to refer to this joke component code as a reference. For the step right after, we're going to be building custom hooks based on refactoring these components, so it'll be conducive to have your code look very similar. All right, with that said, let's head to the next video for a coding challenge on building a stories component. Hey, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to head to the full course at udemy.com/reacthooks tutorial. Since you're coming from YouTube, I'm giving you access to the course at the max discount Udemy lets me create. I've posted details in the video description, and be sure to visit my website at davidtkatz.com as well, where you can find links to connect with me. All right, see you in the next one.